Hey everyone, welcome to session 6 of the STX Next live show. Joining me here today is Matthew Harris. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing really, really good. I'm pleasantly surprised that you invited me back. So it's always nice to talk to you, Kupa.
Yeah, well, we kind of teased it last time, right? That I think it was one of our better sessions actually. And, when we were preparing for it, we left a lot of, different concepts uncovered because we can't possibly cover all of negotiation, which is our topic for today, negotiation for technical managers, part two. We can't possibly cover it all in one go, so we decided to do a second session. Welcome back.
Sure, but as you're aware, all of it comes down to metrics, and I know that if it wasn't going to get any sort of feedback from the audience or in terms of views, probably this would be cut.
We had enough views and enough engagement to invite you back,
Sure.
so
Well,
welcome.
it's good to hear. Surprised, but good to hear.
Anyway, for today, what we have in store for you is we're going to be talking about two big topics. The first big topic being tone of voice and body language, so everything nonverbal that's related to negotiation. And the second big topic being what kind of questions to ask. So I already teased in the promotional copy that you should never ask why during a negotiation. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but we'll cover why you should never ask why. That's for later. So, Matt, when you're thinking about what we're going to cover today, what kind of situations do you think this is going to apply to for technical managers and other professionals?
I think it's going to apply to almost all situations, but I think more importantly, it's going to build on some of the skills we talked about last time. And we're not going to rehash those, right? I mean, when we're looking at mirroring, we're looking at labeling, which we knew were fairly basic skills. We want to give more skills for a technical manager or a manager as a whole to add to their negotiation arsenal.
Exactly. So if you want to learn more about mirroring and labeling, go right back to our previous session. It's available on our YouTube. You can find it on our LinkedIn. And we covered that in some detail. Today, we'll be moving beyond that. So let's jump right in. We want to keep this fairly compressed. And let's talk about tonality and body language. So Matt, why don't you start? Why is tonality, tone of voice, and body language important?
It's really important in terms of better understanding or reading the other person, which I know can be fairly difficult. But you want to see, when you start to practice this, if the tonality, the tone of voice, and the body language is aligned with the words that are coming out of the person's mouth. And listen, we should touch on this very early, just like we did last time. This is another skill that takes practice. We respect the fact that you're not going to be amazing at identifying tonality and body language right from the start. You're going to have to practice it. You're going to have to get uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a piece of research that we had prepared. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think we mentioned it in the title somewhere along with the description. So this is the 7-38-55 rule. And for some of the listeners, probably they've already heard of this, but this was a study that was done by, it was a UCLA professor for sure. Whether it was in the 70s or 80s, I have no idea. But essentially there was a group here, a focus group, that was to assess how much they liked each component of a particular conversation and to apply the score. So if we're looking at the 7, we're looking at, it represents content, what is said, right? 38 represents tonality or the tone of voice, and 55 represents body language. And that number, obviously, 7, 38, 55 adds up to 100.
Yeah, exactly. And, to me, the big takeaway from this is when I first learned of this research, I was really surprised by how small the role of the content is and how large the role is of body language and your tone of voice. So, for me, kind of the big takeaway, making it a little bit more concrete, is it's not what you say, but it's how you say it. It's whether you're using a tone that is encouraging and friendly, or whether you're being sarcastic with your tone. And in terms of body language, it's less important what you say, for example, to your spouse or to somebody you're working with. It's more important to do it, in a warm fashion, to do it with a smile, to do it, looking in their eyes. So that's a big takeaway for me from that.
Yeah, I mean, both the tonality and the body language needs to align again with the words that are coming out. So the words are important. It's just, if you look at this study, or actually if you put it into practice, you really start to see how important tonality and body language really is. So why don't I just give you an example, right? And you
Yeah,
had
sure.
mentioned it, sarcasm, right? So if I say, Cuba, that was a great question, right? Or I could say, Cuba, that was a great question, right? And I put a bit
Yeah,
more sarcasm here, same content, different tonality, probably different body language as well, because you can see my facial expression. I've looked off to the side, I've kind of squinted
exactly.
a little bit here, and it's changed the meaning entirely. And so body language, tonality, both apply here, right?
Yeah. And you know what? I think, in the context of remote conversations and remote negotiations, it's not going to probably happen that you're going to use sarcasm by accident, but it's very easy to sound distracted by accident. It's really easy to give the interlocutor this kind of impression that you're not really focusing on them. When we're having remote conversations, I don't know if that's your experience as well, but I constantly keep thinking, is this one of these calls where the person is really focused on what I'm saying, or is it kind of that they're half there, half checking Slack, right? So it's really important to focus, to indicate through your body language, through through how you're saying what you're saying, that I'm here for you, I'm focused 100% on you. It's as important in one-on-one conversation, a quarterly review or whatever, as it is in a negotiation, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're in this, yes, you want to monitor your tonality and body language. If you see that your counterpart is distracted, I think the next skill, or what we're going to talk about later on, probably after the 15-minute mark, is going to help to probably bring their attention back, right?
Yeah, right. Because you can also use correct questions to bring their attention back. But let's stick with body language for now. So let's say you're in a negotiation, and what do you watch out when you're examining the tone and the body language of your counterpart?
Well, I mean, it's like you said here, right? So you want to make sure that the tone of voice is aligned with the words that are coming out of their mouth, that the body language is aligned with what the words that are coming out of their mouth. And I think that this is what you're really, really looking for. And I know it can be a bit of a challenge, but if you've talked to the person for a little while, you've asked a couple questions, you've seen how they act when they're telling the truth, right? When they're answering fairly simple questions. And your gut should be able to tell or be able to identify when something's out of sync here, that something is not aligned here. And that's when we can go back to a skill we learned the last time, which is really labeling. And we can use a particular label to bring that tone of voice, that body language back aligned with the words.
Yeah, to me, those are situations when somebody's, for example, eyes are kind of darting around, right?
Mm-hmm.
I read once that one indicator that somebody is lying, for example, is that they're looking, into the corner of their eyesight. But I forget which corner it was, because there was a particular corner that they usually
I heard
look into.
bottom left, but I'm not sure. I've never really
Oh,
looked into how valid that is. But listen, why don't we give it just a short example? Because I also want to make sure that we constantly bring this back and be conscious that we're trying to apply this to a management role, technical manager, non-technical manager here. But I could say, if I feel that the person's tone of voice or body language is not aligned with their words, I could say, listen, Mark or Mary, I hear you say you're okay with the terms of the agreement. Okay, say we're in a negotiation. But it sounds by your tone of voice that you aren't sold on it, or there seems to be something that you may not like. And by using labeling to draw this out, I can bring that person back, and there's a mismatch there, and I can align this back with what they're saying, and probably bring them back to maybe even telling the truth to a certain extent.
I think this also has a positive effect in the sense that you really show that you're paying attention to the other person. You're not just trying to get them to say yes to what you want, but also you really want them to kind of buy in to the idea, whether it's signing a contract or pitching an idea for a project together. So imagining myself as Mary, for example, in this example, this tells me that Matt's really been paying attention, and that he wants to know more. And everybody wants to have this impression that you're interested in them and how they're feeling and what their real thoughts are. So I think it works it has a positive impact on a few levels. also in the sense that it turns a negotiation more into a cooperation, which is also something that you want to build, this feeling of it's not you versus me, but it's like the two of us versus the problem here that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've touched on to this point, trying to identify body language, tone of voice with, the person who's speaking. But I love the practice of watching other people, right? So very often when you're in a negotiation or a discussion, it's more than two people in the room, right? It could be four or six. Typically, it can be difficult to address other people in the room because obviously the polite thing to do is to constantly keep your eyes on the person who's talking. But during COVID times, it's more easy than ever, or it's easier than ever, in your Zoom conversation to pay attention to the people who aren't talking, right? Because when they're not talking, when you're not talking, you let your guard down. Your body language and tonality, you're not really paying attention to it. You can see how others are reacting to the person who's speaking, right? And that obviously these cues, these body language or linguistic cues can really help to tell, is the person fully aligned? Should I use a little bit of labeling here to bring them back?
Yeah, and I think it's a unique advantage, with, for example, conversations via Zoom or Hangouts or whichever software, that a lot of people, they don't realize they're on camera all the time. Some of them do turn off their cameras, right? But if they have it turned on, they can give you a lot of intel without even realizing it. So in a negotiation, when every piece of information really matters, and you're looking for that one crucial piece that might make all the difference, then that is something to use, because you see them react in a certain way, and you can draw attention to it. You can say, okay, Mary, I hear you speaking and saying that you're agreeing here, but Mark over there doesn't seem to be too enthusiastic. So, could you talk about that, right?
Yeah,
and I think
I wouldn't necessarily want to throw Mark under the bus at all, but I definitely would use that cue to draw something out, right? So.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe not in such an overt way as I as I just mentioned here. And I think a conversation about tone of voice and body language, we're doing this in November 2020, right? So it can't happen without mentioning the whole remote context, right? So I'm thinking, what kind of additional factors to take into account here when you're talking or negotiating, when you're on a video conference, for example. Is there anything in particular that you pay attention to?
Yeah, and I think I don't know if we touched on this earlier, but there's this, we touched on the 738-55 rule, but there's also this Pinocchio effect. And again, some people will have heard of this, and I'll try and align it a little bit more with the context of the discussion. But we all know Pinocchio. We would have probably seen the movie or watched it. The more Pinocchio lies, the longer his nose gets. And the Pinocchio effect is really that as we lie as individuals, our nose starts to heat up, starts to get maybe slightly more red. It's not really that easy to identify. So if we take Pinocchio effect in terms of the context of a discussion or a negotiation, we're going to want to look for body language or linguistic cues. So body language, as you had mentioned earlier, looking around, probably not paying attention, fidgeting with things is usually a good sign that they probably come out of their truth telling. It's not aligned with the words they're saying. From linguistic cues, it's really the number of words you're using to defend a particular point, right? So we're using more words than are necessary. We're ignoring brevity. These are usually good cues that the person is lying is a strong word, but they're thinking about not telling the whole truth here.
Sure. So in the video conferencing context, I suppose the main signal that you have left here is the number of words. I don't know, with regards to particular lighting, if you can tell if somebody's nose is changing or heating up. But yeah, it is worth paying attention to the content and the amount of the content, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I refer to my kids, right? And I look at my kids and look, kids are not the best at lying. I know when my kids are lying, my son or my daughter, because again, they're really elaborate in their response, right? And they're going out of their way to try to lie. But the truth is, like, we as adults, we're not that much better at lying. We tend to use more words than are necessary when we move away from truth telling, or even worse, we start to use phrases like, why would I lie? Why would I lie about this? Like that's almost like it's too much you're giving right now to defend your point. And again, I think that this is where if you talk to somebody for a couple minutes, you know what they look like more or less when they're telling the truth. You know their tone of voice, how many words they're using, and it can help to identify that, you know what, something's not right here. I'm going to start to use some of the other techniques I know, like labeling, to bring them back to truth telling, and also to just get them to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, this came to my mind when you mentioned fidgeting. I feel like, for example, I have like a base level of fidgeting, so I do fidget a little bit when I'm talking, no matter what, right? Although I'm working on it, and especially controlling myself in a live session environment like this. But once people start going beyond that base level of fidgeting, that's when you can start, kind of actually gathering some information from that. And I've been thinking a lot about the video conferencing context, and also educating myself a little bit here. Even within these live sessions that we're doing here, we've actually picked up some good practices that I think would be interesting to share.
Well, you hit me with a few before the last one that I wasn't aware of, but you're also far more involved within the webinar video conferencing space. But it was really cool because these are things I hadn't considered before, and I think it would be good at this point to share that.
Sure. So both for webinars, but I also think for a negotiation, you need to think a little bit like a video producer, because you are going to be on video. I wouldn't advise having a negotiation without video present. And when you're doing that, a few tips, just a few quick tips from me, tips that we're also trying to observe during these sessions, right? So for example, you don't want your face to be too close to the screen. And one rule of thumb that you can jot down is try to make your face take up vertically a third of what you have of the space that you have on the screen. And we're trying to kind of observe that rule here.
How are we here? I think we're probably fairly aligned here.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. I think we're doing well in that regard. Good. And one piece of feedback that we actually had from our viewers during previous sessions, after session 1, somebody messaged me and they said, maybe this is more for a webinar context, but I think it can work in the negotiation as well. Try to keep your head at the same level as the other speakers, right? So this is also something that needs to be taken into account. What I would say here, I'm not sure if you would agree, is that in the context of video conferencing, tone of voice can be even more important than body language, just because of the simple fact that over half of our body is missing here, right? You can't tell if somebody's legs are moving in a nervous way or in an excited way, because the legs and feet can give off these kinds of signals. So it's even more important if you're trying to observe what we touched upon also in the last session, to try to have this friendly tone of voice, right? To make sure that this is a cooperation, not a negotiation, and your tone of voice indicates that as well. So that's one important tip. And coming back to being a video producer, obviously pay attention to lighting. And we can't cover all of lighting during this session, but I think, if in terms of a 10, 15-minute Google or a research spike, it would be good to get some tips in terms of lighting, because that can just help you come across as more professional.
Yeah,
another thing that can
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Another thing that can help is come on, go ahead. I can see that you want to.
I was just going to say that this is something that I think you've done a much better job here than I have today. So I think I could probably take some feedback in terms of lighting. Currently in my daughter's room right now, which is my COVID-19 office space. So.
Yeah, it's a very overcast day here in Poznań in Poland, and we had to make sure that we have some artificial lighting. Actually, one of the lights on my face is my other screen here, and here too you have some room to use. If you have a second screen, you can put up an image that is more white, will give you a colder light. An image that is more towards the hue of yellow will give you a warmer light, and you can use that to manipulate the way you look on camera, right? And obviously, for example, I took care of having a clear background here with not too many distractions. And personal opinion here, I'm not a great fan of the blurring functionality that Zoom has and Google Meet has. I know a lot of people use it, but to me it's distracting because I keep thinking, oh, how does that work? And oh no, the edges are not exactly blurred out, right? So this is just a personal opinion of mine. And the last point I think that I would mention, well, second to last, is equipment. right? So for example, we're doing, I think, a good job here just by using very discrete equipment, and AirPod in your case, this wireless earphone in my case. Don't use one of these big clunky headsets with a mic if you can afford, not to. And if you're using, I see that quite often. If you're using earphones that are wired, try to hide the wire under your shirt. It's all just going to contribute to you having a more professional look, and it's going to help your authority in negotiation. Right. Oh, and one last point, because I just gestured with my hands here, and that's also something to consider. And it was a mistake that I was doing during the previous sessions, and actually my wife pointed that out to me. When I was just gesturing, I put my hands way too close to the screen. I was saying, Matt, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Try not to do it, because it can come across as aggressive. It can come across as in your face. So again, like I mentioned, there's not as much body language in the video conferencing context, but it's all the more important to really keep it, contained, and to use everything that you have on screen to your advantage. All right. Anything else that we missed from?
Yeah. No, I think we've hit tonality. I think we've hit body language pretty strong. I think it would be good to cover, I guess, the next skill we want to cover during this session.
Sure. Right? Sure. Let's go right into that. Okay. So leaving tonality and body language for a moment here, let's move on to the second part that we have and go back to the title. So never ask why during a negotiation. So let me start like this. Why is asking the right questions important during a negotiation, Matt?
Sure. So maybe we could start with a question to your question, right?
Sure.
In your mind here, who is the person who is in control of a discussion or a negotiation? Is it the person who's talking, or is it the person who is listening actively?
Well, not to spoil too much here, but in the past, I used to think the more I was talking during a negotiation, the more I was winning. I was delivering the arguments that I had prepared, and I thought the person really needs to hear my arguments. And if they just hear and understand why I think this is the way to go, why I think we should do things a certain way, then they're going to be convinced. That's what I used to think.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will probably, smartly say, hey, it's probably the person who's actively listening. But at the end of the day, it sure does feel like we're in control when we're talking. But the truth is, it's the person who's asking smart, open-ended questions that really is in control of the conversation. And I give hard times to some of our really talented technical managers, operation managers, before we're jumping on a call. And I always say, listen, if you think you're talking too much, you are, right? So stop, ask a question right now. Really, a good distribution should be, we should be talking 20, 30% of the time, listening actively 70, 80% of the time.
Yeah, I liked what you mentioned when you were preparing, that the person that's talking, more, they can feel like they're in control, but it's really the illusion of control. And the person who is really in control is the person listening, because they're getting all of the information that is so crucial in a negotiation. So try to give your counterpart that illusion of control and see what they tell you, because very often you can use that to your advantage.
Yeah, you can tell Chris Voss has obviously had a bit of an impact on us, right? Because I think he was the one that sort of coined this term, the illusion of control. But it's true, right? I mean, we feel like we're in control when we're talking. And if we're going to get into a negotiation or a discussion, we want to be the one who's in control. And that involves a lot of active listening and really, really smart questions.
Yeah, it must be said, dear watchers and listeners, if you want to do some research about this in between our sessions, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss is a great book to look into, because it has a lot of great tips for negotiation. And now, okay, so since we covered why asking the right questions is important, let's get right to the topic, or the title of this session. So what types of questions shouldn't you ask during a negotiation?
Typically, you should ask open-ended questions. So in that case, you should probably want to avoid two types of questions. One will be, obviously, as the title suggests, don't ask a why question, right? And I don't know, I'd be curious if this applies to other languages other than English, but why as a question is pretty confrontational, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you think back to when you were a kid or as an adult, when someone asks you, why did you do that? You know, and I understand there's some tone of voice, some tonality there, but it's usually accusative, right? And we get pretty defensive when we start to hear why questions.
Yeah, yeah. I can say from the Polish context, it's quite similar. You know, just asking questions starting with czemu, or you know, in Polish you even have po co, right? So what did you do that for? And I think it can be even more aggressive. I would really avoid that in a negotiation.
Yeah. And the other one, you know, Harvard Law School has a good negotiating program. I've read a few things in terms of what they teach, and they go probably a step further. Why questions are an issue, but also to not ask yes, no, or leading questions like, don't you think that's a good idea? Which, you know, not only does not draw out any sort of information, it doesn't make the counterpart or the other party feel involved, and probably starts to touch on some really fake responses, like a fake yes, which we won't touch on, but hopefully we'll cover in future sessions, you know, distinguishing what is a fake yes here.
Yeah, watchers, we have plans for session 3 and beyond after we look at how this one performs, obviously. So, you know, leave a comment if you're watching us. Leave a comment if you have questions, by the way, about negotiation, because, you know, we're covering what we have to cover here. But if there's anything unique to your context that you want to ask about, we're here, and, you know, Matt and I can share our experiences and our tips. Now, in terms of leading questions, yeah, they can feel really presumptuous, in my opinion. Don't you think that's a great idea? This implies that I think it's a great idea, and why don't you think that way? And it can feel like you're really trying to trap somebody in a way of thinking. It, I think, evokes this natural impulse to kind of revolt against it, and you start looking at these ways that this particular idea might not be so great. All right, so yeah, that's something to avoid. So, you know, we mentioned in the title and now, never ask why. Don't ask yes, no leading questions. So let's kind of unveil what types of questions should you ask them? What types of questions do you use?
Sure. So these would be calibrated questions, or to simplify things, they're just open-ended questions, right? Calibrated has become a popular term, but these are typically how and what questions, right? And you can turn almost, if not all, why questions, and you can turn it into a how or what questions. And it would be really interesting for you to test this out as a listener to see what sort of results you have. So if we tie back to the reason we got started with these sessions, if we're looking at it from a technical manager's point of view, and we were to negotiate with a vendor, right, a third-party vendor, and we were to say, why can't you accept 7-day payment terms? Well, this seems pretty confrontational. I know from experience that this is not going to draw out the response I'm looking for, and would probably make the other party a little bit more defensive. But let's turn the why into a what or how question, and we start to say, what is it about 7-day payment terms that is important to your company? And in this way, you tell me, instead of me sort of answering, did that, you know, what sort of feeling did you get when I switched that why question over to a what question?
Well, the first type of question, why can't you accept this? It makes it more argumentative. I think it makes it more that there's a position, and you're already implying what my position is here. You can't accept these terms. And now I'm left with the task of actually defending this position. Well, I can't accept it because, and I start thinking of reasons why this doesn't work for me. And this isn't what you want. And now when you're asking, what is it about 7-day payment terms that doesn't work for me, it's more explorative. It's more, you know, we have this kind of black box of the reasons behind my thinking. I'm opening that box and I'm showing you what's inside, but it's more neutral. Again, it's more in the spirit of cooperation. Like, look at, you know, what my situation is here, and these are the reasons, and this is what's important for me in this context.
Yeah, it puts you in the position of trying to solve the problem, right? And you're asked your opinion. You have to stop. It makes you think. Generally, it draws out more information that, if we're in a negotiation, is going to be extremely valuable for me. So it's not only about giving the person an illusion of control, but again, it comes back to our first session where we want to still be drawing out as much information possible that can be useful. as the negotiation goes along.
Yeah, the more we talk about this, the more I think that, just using the word negotiation might put people in a context that's not productive for them. Because a negotiation, on the surface of it, it can seem about argumentation. It can seem about, your arguments versus my arguments, and that's
Sure.
that. But really, when you're thinking more in terms of an exploration, more in terms of active listening, mutual listening, then it can uncover much better outcomes for both sides, really, very often. So, yeah, I was thinking if you could give a few more examples of these calibrated questions. That was a what question. What about a how question?
Okay, so if I were into a negotiation, probably in the later stages, I may want to wrap it up in terms of how would you like to proceed? Right? This would be a good example. How will this decision impact other stakeholders in the organization, right? Or if you're given a difficult terms in terms of a bargaining or a negotiation, you could always say, how are we supposed to do that? Which I know is really, really difficult question to ask. It feels almost unnatural that the person's going to bark back at you and say, well, you're going to do that because you have to do that, right? But the reality is when you formulate this as a how or what question and shut up right after, right? It gets that person to think. It makes them want to probably contribute to the possible solution. I think you'd have to test it out to see how impactful it really is.
Yeah. So if there's one of the many takeaways from this is try to apply that one. How am I supposed to do that? And yeah, from session one, we know that already that you're supposed to shut up, leave a lot of silence, and let the other party just fill that silence, and it gives you an advantage.
Again, it's awkward. We know it. It takes practice. All of these skills take a lot of practice. They're not that natural. And as I think we had some comments in the last one, we don't want to be disingenuous, right? So we want to practice, but at the same time, show general interest, show respect. These things are going to be really, really important as you apply these skills.
Yeah. I also liked another question you mentioned just before. How would this change this, or maybe not offer, but this, how would our assistance, for example, impact your day-to-day business? For me, it puts me in this kind of mood of looking into the future, looking at what's possible, right? And I'm kind of filling in the gaps. You don't have to tell me about the advantages of the solution because I can imagine them trying to answer that question. At least that's what pops in my mind when I hear that kind of question. But you already mentioned that asking some of these questions can be a little bit risky. So let's flip the conversation like we did last time. We asked, what if mirroring and labeling doesn't work? So today we're talking about calibrated questions. What if calibrated what if calibrated questions don't work, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, so first it has to be a little bit in terms of how you formulate the question. It has to make sense in terms of a how or what question. But I think more important is going to be the level of interest or respect you're giving when you're saying it, right? And it does come back to body language and tonality as well, right? You can mess up calibrated questions if the other aspects of the 7, 38, 55 rule, or if the 38 and the 55 don't align with the 7 as well. So these are sort of ways where, if you're not applying 2 of these skills from today, you could run into some problems with calibrated or open-ended questions.
Exactly. And think about it like that. Thus far, we covered 4 big techniques, right? Mirroring, labeling, then we had tone and body language, and now calibrated questions. 3 of those are really mostly about the content. Although with mirroring, you could also do physical mirroring, right? You could mimic the movements of the other party. And so 3 techniques are mostly about this 7% that is not as important as the remaining 93, right? So do pay attention to, do you watch your listener? Do pay attention to how you're saying all that you're saying, because, and I'm trying to kind of relate back to it, because for me, whenever I'm picking up a new skill, and negotiation is one of those, it's all about the mindset, and the mindset informs a lot of your decisions. And here, the mindset should be, try to turn it into a cooperation, use active listening, and really focus on listening more than you're talking. and try to involve this mindset of just keeping things positive between parties, not confrontational. So again, this is something to keep in mind here. And also, I just remembered one tip about body language that I think is important. For those of you who stayed with us the whole 35 minutes, here's something bonus for you. You know, eye contact is really important. And in a negotiation that's happening, you know, when the two parties are physically in the same room, it's easy. You look into the person's eyes. You try to do it as much as possible. The research I read indicates that the more you can do it, the better, really. And, you know, participants in studies basically showed a direct correlation between the amount of eye contact and the likability of the counterpart. And yeah, you really want to be likable in a negotiation. During video conferencing, though, eye contact is not so obvious, because my natural instinct when we're doing this, I have you on my screen here, right? And I'm looking at you displayed on my screen. But if there's a really important point that you want to make, you should look at your webcam. It feels really awkward. I'm doing it right now. It feels really awkward. It feels like I'm talking to a machine. But you need to be looking at the webcam for the other person, the most important person here, to get this feeling that I'm really paying attention to you. I'm saying something important. I'm looking it directly in the eyes as I say it. There's no falsehood in it. I'm not darting away with my gaze here. So try to jot that down and use that, and you're going to see that it makes a difference. Just look into your webcam for eye contact when you're doing video conferencing.
Yeah, and don't get super overwhelmed. I know that there's a lot of things to remember, and I'm guilty as you're not looking into, you know, the light on the top of my laptop when I'm trying to say something really important. Try not to overwhelm yourself, right? Just one or two new things, you know, for each discussion. Improve this, and over time you'll see a huge difference, right? So try not to apply everything all at once. It's just not going to be possible.
Exactly, and you know, that's why all of these sessions, we're not just doing them live, we're also having them recorded, and you can revisit session 1 when we covered mirroring and labeling, which we just alluded to today, and you can replay this session and write down the tips that we had today. And I'm saying had because, well, our time is almost over for today. We did have a role play in mind for this session as well, but we decided to go a little bit more into detail into the content that we had prepared. And for the role play, we were thinking of actually bringing it to you a little bit later. We'll record it separately and we'll show you during a role play. We're thinking of different kinds of situations, maybe a salary negotiation, maybe something different, how to actually apply all of what we discussed during the last 2 sessions. So mirroring, labeling, calibrated questions, and we'll also pay attention to tone and body language too. So we really want to make this a very good example of these techniques in action, which is why you'll get a video of that. We're aiming next week, right?
Yeah, I think that's the goal. I think we have to really be able to show how these are applied. It's really easy to talk about these topics, but you know, to give you an example of how they're used in practice.
Yeah. So you can look forward to that. If you have any additional comments about negotiation, you can leave them on the channels where this showed up. So on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and on Twitter. And yeah, I think that's all that we had to cover for today. Any final tips to share here, Matt?
No, I think we've covered this pretty extensively over almost 40 minutes, and I think we'll come back to some of these again in future sessions, right? So I think there's enough content there, and hopefully when we do the role play, it'll make a little bit more sense.
Yeah, exactly. There's quite a few things we have in store for further sessions, and you know, I think this one has been, at least looking at the concurrent viewers, also quite a nice one. So, you know, Matt, I think you can go ahead and start.
Maybe I'll make the cut. Yeah.
Start thinking about preparing the next one. Okay, everyone. So, like I mentioned, a pretty overcast day here in Poland. Not a lot of sunlight, but I hope we made your day just a little bit brighter with these tips. All of you have a really nice day, and we'll see you soon next time.